Well, or is it that it moves automatically when I don't press anything?
No, I just pressed it again, so like it's on the right display.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, welcome everybody. So this is a joint paper with my colleague Roselyne. Actually, she's also from Aix-en-Provence, but she has spent all her career either in the US or in Australia. So we are looking at real estate bubbles. I don't think with this audience I need to motivate too much why we need to work on real estate bubbles. They are important in many respects in terms of course, households' wealth, in terms of driving household consumption, and also from a financial point of view, they are behind the systemic risk. Well, we've discovered over history that they can play an amplifying role. They can even generate depressions, recessions, and also they can have very long-lasting effects, like in Japan. And actually, I'll be talking about Japan in that paper. So we badly need methods to detect bubbles, because a lot of people talk about bubbles, but I'm not absolutely sure they know what they are talking about. So this is something we are going to see. And well, I especially have in mind theoreticians. So the problem is, can we simply, well, the first question which is excluded here, there is no way you can detect bubbles by simply looking at prices. So anybody looking at cryptocurrencies, for instance, should simply go to the beach. Well, not here, maybe. Well, there is a beach, actually, I reckon.
It's nice.
On the street next door. May not be what you expect. So should we look at the price to rent ratio in the same way as in stock markets, we look at price earnings ratios? Is that enough? Or do we need to go further and control for fundamentals before testing for bubbles? Not after. And well, this is an illustration for the Japanese case, because of course it's well known. And we all have some ideas about the dating of the bubbles, so it's an interesting case to look at. So, well, that's a theoretician's view. You have a bubble whenever the price is over the fundamental value. Problem is, as you know also very well, in the real estate market, what is the fundamental value? Well, it should be forward-looking, looking at the future stream of rents. That's okay. But of course, difficulties arise because you don't always have values, you have indices. And again, well, should we consider that the rent is enough as a fundamental, or should we dig deeper? Well, now here there is something I will emphasize. It's explosive. So that's really in the, I would say, recent work on bubble detection, empirical bubble detection. This is a key word. However, well, you can detect periods when some variable explodes mildly, not widely. Well, however, maybe it's not enough for different reasons. You will see that a lot of work has been done detecting bubbles, but people have just forgotten to eyeball the data. So when the price is falling, if you detect a bubble, well, it's no bubble at all. Well, okay, this you know well, user cost, and so on. And of course, the owner saves something and so on and so forth. So all these things are very important to take into account in this type of work. Well, this literature is relatively, well, should I say old or young, depends on your point of view. A couple of decades. I quote here some surveys of old work, and we have had a series of alternative empirical methods suggested to deal with that. Well, I would say that most of them were old style, which means that they had not understood that to have a bubble, you need an explosion in the price. So at most, they were considering non-stationary prices, but it's unfortunately a little bit more complex. So here, as you may already have understood, we rely on a two-step approach. In the first step, we just look at the price to rent ratio and see whether we can date bubbles in the real estate market on that basis. And then, well, of course, we start digging deeper, try to detect the right fundamentals and the ones which are significant. And after that, we take the residual, which we consider to be the non-fundamental component, and we test whether this residual itself is mildly explosive. So the key person here, of course, is Peter Phillips, a very productive econometrician. He's also very good at PR because he has had a sequence of tests, especially bubble tests. So the latest vintage we are looking at is 2015, which, well, is useful because his previous tests only allow one bubble. Here you can have several bubbles in a sequence, and you can precisely date when the bubble starts and when the bubble stops. In separate work, which I might refer to later, this technology can also be used to detect crashes and to date crashes, because it's not because a bubble stops that you have a crash, because you need to have an explosive crash, which is more demanding. Well, the idea is actually extremely simple. It's a regression which, well, almost everybody has used now in time series analysis, which is an augmented decay Fourier test. The trick is simply to change the null. Usually the null is non-stationary against stationarity. Here, no. You basically consider that the alternative is the explosive behavior. So that's certainly quite different, and it's done in a quite subtle way, in a recursive backward-forward way, but, well, that's not really. So what's the intuition here? The intuition is you're going to detect a bubble on a given window, so be careful. When we will be giving dates, it's only the end point of the period of the window. So you need a certain window size, which is optimized depending on your sample size and so on and so on. So that's a Japanese application from the 1980s up to the eve of the pandemic. And well, we see clearly that, of course, there is a very well-known late 1980s thing, then the very long collapse. And the shaded areas are the bubbles detected on the log of the price to rent ratio. So apart from the very well-known one, which looks rather short-lived, only 1 year, with our quarterly data from OECD, you see that There is a second one, which seems very, very long lasting. And of course, you've already seen that this corresponds to the problem I mentioned before. It's a time when the ratio was itself full. So we have to stop a little bit about these two bubbles to see whether they are really bubbles, not simply from the point of view of whether the price is falling or not, but also, very important, looking at what observers, regulators, practitioners thought about it, because this is equally important. Of course, we need tools, but they are not enough. In the same way as we need judgment, but it's not enough. Well, this is very well known. The thing is, of course, observers basically say that this bubble was not there in 1980. So maybe we have to be careful not to date the start too early. Well, here you have a list of, well, Constantine is one of the contributors here. And you see that the starting dates vary quite a lot for this first bubble. And the same for the end of the bubble. It seems that it should not be considered to have lasted up to 1991. Well, you see that some work even is unable to detect any bubble there. So that's a little bit strange. They dated later. That's, well, so now the second bubble, the one which lasted quite long. Well, here, of course, we have many reasons to expect a bubble. Why? Because Japan was a pioneer in developing quantitative easing from March 2001 to April 2006. So this ample provision of liquidity, you would expect it to move quickly to the housing market. However, again, if we look at observers or practitioners in Japan, they say no. At that time, the market was really, well, languishing. And also, as I said before, the market was falling. So, well, that's means, and you see it in other occasions in the table which I showed in the previous slide, that very often people detect bubbles when prices are, or price to rent ratios are falling. So we really need a combination of statistical work, eyeballing the data, listening to experts in the field, and so on. So now what are we doing? We start with the price to rent ratio, which we are going to relate to some fundamentals, well, carefully chosen to suit the Japanese case. And then when we will have done that, with some new methodology developed by Peter Phillips again, which I'm going to present, we will only at that time try to detect bubbles in the residual and then compare the dating of that exercise to see whether it matches the initial dating that I've already presented. Of course, we are certainly not the first to try and relate housing prices and fundamentals in Japan. So here you have some studies. Some of them are quite interesting because they look at the time series characteristics, the short-run effects of fundamentals, the long-run effects, and so on. So it seems quite interestingly that the variables sometimes are not the same in the long run and in the short run relationship. So it's certainly not something we are trying to do. Well, you will see that the methodology is quite different. So that's the estimation method, or I should say estimation methods, because it's, well, basically Phillips and Shuping-Shi, she's actually a colleague of Roslyn's at Macquarie. They build on 3 series of contributions, some of them also by Peter Phillips. So basically, it's some sort of sophisticated instrumental variable method. Why X? X means you have control variables. You have some exogenous variables there, and so on. So, well, I'm not going to go into this. Basically, it's robust and so on. So the econometricians have done their proper work. If you want to know more about this, I can give you the email of Roslyn. She will be happy to interact with you. So now that's the intuition. Basically, you start from, well, notation is not straightforward, sorry for that. So this is growth in the price to rent ratio, and you relate it to this vector X of fundamentals. And well, after you have done that, you just accumulate things to recover a fundamental value, and then you extract this fundamental value from the price rent ratio. Of course, there is an alternative approach, but which is much more limited because it's in a vector autoregressive system. So you cannot put too many variables there because otherwise you, especially we only have quarterly data, so you risk over parameterizing the whole thing. Okay, so that's the plot of the different fundamentals. You see that there is a long list, but don't worry. A number of them are going to prove insignificant, so we will drop them. So, well, we have standard things here from the supply side and the demand side, even employment data, and, well, population, of course, in Japan, that's an issue. Well, so this is the result with only presenting the significant variables. You see that 3 of them did not prove significant, so I don't report, well, general to specific type of approach as usual. So the 3 variables, the top 3 have the right signs. The 3rd one does not have, but it's only because during that period you had an inverse movement between PRR and population. So this is like, well, some sort of spurious effect. But, well, it shows not to hide it, just to show it, which actually is quite interesting because in the work of Peter Phillips and Shuping-Shi, they don't even show a table like this. So they should just say we did the IBX, and okay, we are only going to test whether the residual is explosive or not, but we will not go farther than this. So these are the 3 bubble periods that we detect. Of course, important, you see that the middle one, which we said earlier was a little bit strange, is not there anymore. So that's quite reassuring. It means that controlling for fundamentals insulates you from detecting spurious bubbles. You see that the first one overlaps. I put here the one initially detected, or the bubbles initially detected. You see that the first one a little bit overlaps, even though it's slightly longer. You have the middle one, and well, in the paper, which actually you can access, it's published as a chapter in a handbook edited by Charles Lung. So we explain all the views of practitioners, regulators, and observers who actually seem to agree that this was a bubble period. And of course, you have the last one where there was some stimulus by the Japanese authorities. So that makes some sense. And of course, the eyeballing seems to be okay because we see that during these 3 episodes, definitely the price, the non-fundamental component was rising. Okay, so I think I'm almost on time, even maybe 1 minute early. So I can have the luxury of providing you with a conclusion. Well, of course, bubbles can arise on many different assets. In separate work, not for Japan, but for China, we even looked at how how bubbles move from one market to another, i.e. stock market to real estate market. In the present case, we see that it's absolutely mandatory to pre-filter the right-hand side variable from the influence of fundamentals in order to extract some non-fundamental component, and then to be able to date the start and end of bubbles. Well, this is, of course, a cautionary note that we have to be very careful not to take every detected bubble at face value. Some of them are simply not there. And conversely, you saw that some bubbles which were not detected on the simple ratio, they appeared after having controlled for fundamentals. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have one question concerning your housing starts variable. You said that it was not significant. You used it as a lag parameter, or did you take the...
Well, we took what would be significant or not significant. We tried both things, and what the model said was significant, well, in the present case, insignificant, so we dropped it, but we optimized the lag with the usual criteria.
Thank you.
I have a question too. So I wonder, is it possible to have a bubble of events as well? And if you have that, controlling by the rent enough to, clean up the fundament.
Okay, thank you for these 2 important questions. Well, of course, on paper, it's possible to have a bubble on the rent, but well, I imagine you have maybe more experience than I have about rents. I'm rather focusing on prices usually. So I would quite doubt it. And when I look at, the relative movement of the numerator and the denominator, I mean, usually the price maybe rises twice as much as the denominator. But of course, we cannot exclude it. And this is definitely why we put it there. Otherwise, we would simply test that on the prices. So yes, of course, it's possible. But as we see here, it's not enough to take this as a fundamental, which is a very important teaching, because in the present value theory and all these things, we would rather simply focus on this.
I have a very related question, because whenever the user cost formula is somehow tested, many people then just use rents reported in service as rents paid right now. That includes new contracts and existing contracts. In what we know about most housing markets or rental markets in Europe, long contracts are completely different than new contracts. In terms of prices or rents they pay, these can be like universes, right? So a lot, it's actually explained by looking at the units. And then you see much more. which I think also makes sense when you look at new prices. Then maybe also the new rents are the more relevant ones, or depending a bit on what exactly, right? But that's maybe also why things look as they look.
Okay, well, of course, you can always zoom.
Yeah, but it's just
Here,
automatic.
we are using macro data, and we are using comparable data to the other work existing in the field,
Yeah, but-
OECD
Yeah.
and so on. So anybody can replicate. Of course, then we can dig and find some more precise data, yeah, definitely. But before you zoom, you first need to have
No, I
a general.
think that was not the comment. The comment is not more precise data or not, but the right conceptual of this data. Do you want to have the currently paid rent of an entire society? Or do you want to have new rents on the market? That tells just two different stories, and I think it should be clarified what would be the right one for detecting a bubble, because I'm not sure, honestly. And I think it needs to be discussed, because if we get.
I don't have the answer. I don't know what is in that index.
Exactly, that's a
to tell
problem.
you.
That's a
Well,
problem.
no, it's not a problem for us because we are doing like what others are doing. So I think what you say is right, but the problem is then, of course, the work will not be compared. So I think it's another paper,
Maybe that.
would be welcome, but okay, but still controlling for other fundamentals. Rents, even sophisticated ones, would not do the trick.
I would add what, it's not a question, it's a compliment. Compliment to your question, because indeed, if you look at the house prices, then they are thought to contain two components. The one is fundamental and another is speculative. So the fundamental is based on, since the housing is both consumer and investment good, so the fundamental part is based on the demand for housing as consumer good, while the speculative one is based on the housing as investment good. In case of rent, it's on the consumer part. You cannot really invest in rent in order to speculate in it, in order to re-rent the same housing later with a higher rent. So therefore, it's thought at least that, well, technically it's possible that the rent can develop exponentially, and it's not exponentially, but explosively. So if you apply a Phillips test to rents, and we did it in case of Germany, for example, and many other OECD countries, we found that there might be cases when you observe the explosive behavior of rents, but from the theoretical point of view, it's hardly possible. And talking about the rent control and speculative price bubbles, so together with my co-author Sebastian Kohl, we wrote a paper on the possible effects of housing policies on formation of speculative price bubbles. And for example, the effect of rent control turned out to be statistically significantly negative. So it seems that it reduces the probability of speculative price bubbles, probably because of the fact that it affects future
Investment.
or future rental revenues.
Yes, but you would still need to, even if you were, possibly you would need also to control your rents for fundamental components. Default testing for bubble. Maybe you could apply this to both the numerator and the denominator separate. That remains to be done.
Yeah.
Daniela?
Yes. Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, good morning, everyone, again, and thank you very much for being here. I'm happy to present my work. This is like the second time I'm presenting it. It's some work in progress, so every comment I will say is very much welcome. It's not going to be on rents nor rent control, but mostly focusing on prices. And so I'm going to talk about labor market shocks across heterogeneous housing markets. I'm doing my PhD in Aix-Marseille School of Economics. I didn't mention this. And so first, starting with the motivation. We talked a lot already yesterday about the problem of housing affordability. And housing affordability is one of the biggest challenges in the developed world, and not just that. And if we look at data across OECD countries, housing prices have risen much faster than the general inflation rate. And housing affordability is especially a problem in big cities where most of the jobs and opportunities are located. And this is especially true for low-income households and workers. And most of the existing literature in housing is focusing on housing supply related factors related to the affordability problem, and with a focus on a national-wide perspective. In this work, I'm going to focus on demand-side factors mostly, and in particular, I'm going to assess what's the effect of a change in the composition of the local buyers to the housing price distribution in local housing markets. Yeah, a set of labor shocks, and so I'm gonna use the perspective of local housing submarkets. Before moving on, I want to specify which type of labor shocks I'm gonna look at, and which type of local markets I'm gonna use as reference. So, which type of labor shocks? As labor shocks, I'm using the concept of routine bias technological change, or task bias structural change, as formalized by the literature on labor economics by author and co-authors. And this technological change, what the empirical literature has shown, is that it benefited mostly positively the high-skilled workers, because the technology advances that we in developed countries experience over the past 40 years are mostly complementary to the high-skills workers type. And I use this change as a source of variation in the composition of the local buyers, and as a source of income shock for this specific type of local residents. Which type of local housing submarkets I am considering? I am considering, so my special unit is the local labor market, as formalized by Klosfeld and Werner, that is based on workers' commuting flows. This will come later, but so my country of the country I'm going to analyze is Germany, and for Germany we have 401 local labor market units. And within each local labor market, I define 4 different quality submarkets based on the price quartile level. So I'm using price as a synthetic indicator of quality, following previous papers, in particular this paper I'm going to quote afterwards by Langboyd and co-authors, 2015. It's paper, and so they as well use the price as the main indicator of quality. So in this context, I have 401 local labor markets, and within each labor market, I define 4 different housing submarkets based on the price rank of each spatial unit in each year. So in the first step, I estimate hedonic indices of prices for each local labor market and for each year. And in a second step, I rank each housing observed, so each estimated hedonic price for the housing based on the local ranking in each year. If you have a question, do not hesitate at this point. Yes, I will.
So maybe, so this means that some can be run quarter 1 in 1 year and quarter 2 in another period?
I exclude the repeated houses. So it's not, it's a cross section of housing. So yeah, I simply divide the distribution in quartiles each year and for each spatial unit. Yes. So the main mechanism, I put here another slide on the main mechanism I want to analyze is a mismatch of demand and supply in these segmented markets. So the idea is that once there is this, due to this routine bias technological change, we observe a change in the composition of the local population, the local workers, and a change in, and this lead to changes in preferences for specific housing characteristics, because different type of workers want different type of housing. So when they arrive in a local labor market, they're going to look for housing belonging to a specific submarkets. I work for Amazon, I arrive in Berlin, I'm going to look for an expensive house because I can afford an expensive house. And this gonna lead to increase in prices at the top of the distribution, but if the supply at this segment of the distribution doesn't match with the demand, this is gonna generate spillovers down local price distribution. But that's the logic of the mechanism I want to study. I know there are also supply side factors that so far I'm not taking completely into account in my analysis, in particular changes in the composition and in the availability of housing supply and land availability. Why it matters? First, this has consequences for within and between cities, real wage and wealth inequalities. We know that according to OECD statistics, housing is the main asset for most of the households and across countries. Because rising prices can create rising housing prices, especially at the bottom of the distribution, can create displacement of low-skilled workers outside of these cities, where indeed, as mentioned, jobs and opportunities mostly are concentrated. And results from this type of analysis can inform place-based policies, also from an equity versus efficiency perspective, like it can help answering question, for example, is it good to concentrate most of the economic activity in big cities, or we should push a model of development which is more uniformly spread across countries, and also informing central banks and governments on the local trend of housing market, because mortgages for housing is actually the main share of total households debt. It accounts for about 70% on average across OECD countries. So understanding the price dynamics at different quartile of the different submarkets or segments of the housing distribution can help central banks in developing effective monetary policies and for stability reasons. So my context is the German one. I study again. I focused on this markets for sales in the period 2007-2019. And I also have data on rents, but for the moment I'm not considering them in this analysis because the rental market, as we saw yesterday, it's highly regulated, it's more volatile, and housing prices capitalize better this type of structural change that I'm studying. And I also have years observation for years after 2019, but I am excluding them because of COVID. Maybe in the future, I will also use them. Germany is a peculiar case. The 45% of households are homeowners. It's a low share compared to other OECD countries, but it's still significant. And between 2006 and 2020, it is the country that contributed the most to the year-to-year growth in housing in the Eurozone. And it still shows high spatial variation in terms of labor and housing market outcomes, and about 70% of innovation of enterprises are innovation active. So many good reasons to study the German context. Besides that, the fact that I have data availability for that for the country. Some related literature, I mentioned already the paper by Lamboit and co-authors, 2015, and there is another paper by Matanen and co-authors that use this framework of housing market segmentation to understand the spillovers ups and down from the distribution. But on top of, so what I want to add to these findings, it's to understand, to focus on the change in the composition of the local demand, as mentioned before. Some other related literature comes from the gentrification, the paper by Girardin and co-authors, and the literature on urban inequalities. I'm not going into the details for these slides. I'm going on. And briefly, what I do empirically, I take advantage of the time and spatial variation in the distribution of abstract jobs within each local labor market units to build a shift share instrument and provide evidences then that in the short and medium run, changes in the composition of the local demand generates spillovers along the price distribution. And theoretically, this is still ongoing. I start building on these assignment models as developed by Lamboit and co-authors to formalize this mismatch across different types of segments. The data I have, so for the housing market, I'm using listing housing price data from Immobilien Scout. This is one of the biggest German platform. They cover about 50% of the total housing market, and they provide price on a monthly basis from 2007 to 2021. For this survey for each housing, I have the main dwelling characteristics, so living area in square meter, number of rooms, number of bedrooms, year of construction, etc. And after all the cleaning and trimming, I am left with 7 million observation on flats. I focus only on flats, so I excluded other type of housing. And I use this data to build yearly hedonic price indices at the local labor market level using a postal code and time fixed effect plus the interaction. And I only consider local labor market for which I have more than 50 observation, which it's 398. So most all the local labor market. These data are freely provided by the WI. And for the labor market side, I have I have access to the administrative spell dataset, the IAB. This is the data called CL. It's 2% individuals drawn from integrated employment biography from 1975 to 2019. And I have the main information on workers' characteristics, age, skills, occupation sector, city of residence and work, and wage. My sample, the sample I consider is full-time employees aging between 18 and 65 years old. And I use this data mostly to build the statistics on wages and for the shift share, for building my shift share. The empirical research design I'm using, I mentioned already, so it's shift share, but here I brought down the main specification, main OLS specification, and I'm studying, so what I'm interested in is this beta, the effect of this beta. And I interact, so this coefficient is interacted with the variation of the share of abstract jobs in each spatial units over time, and an indicator that takes value 1, 2, 3, or 4, depending on whether the housing belongs to the first, second, or third, or fourth quartile within each spatial units. Then I have a set of controls, and here I'm using the change in the logarithmic change in prices over time for the housing I in local labor market C at time T. Now, the OLS, if the share of abstract occupation across local labor market would have been random, then the OLS would have been a good specification, but there are threats to this identification because the share of abstract jobs actually cannot be distributed as random. So for this reason, I use this shift share instrument to obtain heterogeneous variation in the proportion of abstract jobs by exploiting, so the national increase in the share of abstract occupations. This is my shifter across sectors, and the variation in the exposure of each local labor market due to different industrial composition. And I fix the share to the initial period. Actually, in my preferred specification, the shares are fixed in are fixed 5 years before the initial period. Then I do the test also for 10 years before, 15 years before, and 27 years before. I have 31 sectors. I use this categorization of sectors because otherwise I will have very little observation if I use more granular sectors categorization. Now, before moving to the results, before showing you the results of the main specification, I show you some stylized facts on the housing markets and on the labor market. So this is first thing that I want to show you is that the housing market is segmented, because this is the main assumption that under which I built this research. So this is the cumulative growth for the first quartile of housing price distribution, second and third at the national level. And you can see that already at the national level, they show different trends in growth over the time of observation. And when we look at different type of cities, the trends are different. So there are some differences. Here I plot the cumulative growth for big cities and in big cities. And big cities, I consider big cities those local labor market belonging to the top 25% in the distribution of the population. So I have data on population for 2011, and the most populated one are my big city group, and the least populated one are my small cities group. So you can see that up to early 2010, so 2011, 2012, the trends in cumulative growth across the different submarkets are quite similar, while they evolved differently later on. In particular, the gap, so the cumulative growth for the different submarkets in big cities was actually quite similar, while the gap in the rates of growth in small cities was increasing over time after the early 2010. And this means this is also more striking if we look. Can you go here? So if we look at superstar cities, so this is a smaller sample of the 14th biggest cities, and this is the evolution of cumulative growth for the rest of the country. So you can really see that the bottom part of the price distribution increased as much as the top part of the distribution. If you go there. And this means that the housing prices in big cities, so actually the housing market in big cities, it's more homogeneous in terms of prices today than it was back at the beginning of the period of observation. So some statistics facts to retain from these: housing markets are segmented, and they show heterogeneous trends across local labor market. And prices of low quality housings are increasing more in big cities compared to the small cities. And this means that there is a reducing differential between low and high quality housing in big cities. Now, if we compare this data on prices with the evolution of wages across different type of markets, we see exactly the opposite. So while the market for housing is becoming more homogeneous, the labor market in those big centers, it's actually becoming more unequal. And if we look at the price to wage ratios, so I computed annual wages, for example, in big cities for the first quartile, it was at 6.16, so it was higher than the other quartile of the distribution. And we can go back. So then when we look at the trends in the share of occupations, what has happened? The share of employees in abstract occupations have increased indeed, particularly in those big cities, starting from the early 2010s. And in particular, so in 2012, in big cities, the share of abstract job was 36%, and in 2019, it was 41%, while in small cities, it goes from 30% to 32%. While the share of the routine, so here you have the share of the routine from 1992 to 2019, it decreased in the small cities and in the big cities as well, but much more in the big cities. Now, for the categorization of routine, abstract, and manual occupations, I'm using the definition by Daniela and co-authors, and then grouping the type of occupation in the standard, abstract, manual, and routine as outer and door. Yes.
Maybe you can provide a couple of examples of abstract and routine job.
Yes, for example, well, abstract is manager of any manager or professors. So these are considered as abstract jobs, and routine is considered as employees in manufacturing industries or secretaries. So these type of jobs are considered routine. So here in these slides, I want to convince you that these two facts, so the increase in prices at the bottom of the distribution, so for low quality apartments in big cities, it's correlated with the increase in the share of abstract occupations in those same cities. And when we look at, so here I have some first results from the Bartik shift share analysis. So when I run my main regression, so here I'm using I'm fixing the share at 5 years before the initial period of observation, and I'm using the as the delta as the variation at the period 2019, and I include local labor market fixed effect and the standard error are clustered by county. And what I see is that for a 1% increase in the share of abstract jobs, there has been a 14.6% increase in the housing prices at the bottom of the distribution. So what I observe is that actually the coefficients, these beta coefficients varies along the price distribution. And for this, I use the variation in the share of abstract jobs across the labor markets. Now, I started doing different robustness checks, which I will continue in the next weeks and months. I know also that I'm aware that on this Bartik instrument, there is currently a big discussion, and there is a new paper that came out just 2 days ago that I need to catch up. So there is a series of robustness checks that I still need to do. But for the moment, I'm using different type of categorization for cities, for also my Bartik, for the housings, and as I mentioned, different lagged instruments. I don't think I will have time to go to the framework of the theoretical model, so I will just sum up what I presented so far. First, the housing markets are segmented, and housings of different quality experience heterogeneous capital gains over time. The submarkets within cities evolved differently, and today the market is more homogeneous in terms of price. It's equally homogeneous in terms of prices in big and small cities, while wages are more unequal in big cities. So this means that there is an increase in burden as we saw with the price over wage ratios for the low-income residents in those areas. And the change in the composition of the local residents and their income levels affects price heterogeneously, and these are the results from the share analysis. And while so far, so in theory of this type of models, while assignment models explain spillovers up very well, they lack in explanation for the spillovers down. So why, even when we have an increase in the share of high income residents, we observe an increase at the bottom of the distribution and not just at the top. And the this is what I will argue because of supply constraints one idea for extension of the model would be to include endogenous supplies, so to understand how actually the type of housing supply varies based on the type of local residences. So a supply of housing which reflect the preferences of the local residents. And this is it. Thank you for listening.
I'd like to ask, I mean, if I understood correctly, one of your slides with betas. So if there are 4 betas and index corresponds to a quartile of the
Yes.
So just to check if my understanding is correct. So the beta 1 is the largest, while beta 4 is the smallest.
Yes.
And this beta measures the effect of the share of, let's say, I mean, what you call abstract jobs in the market, and the price increase in the lower, in the corresponding segment. So
yes,
the prices.
Exactly.
So it's probably related to your question 4 here, or point 4 here. Why should the increase in abstract jobs lead to a higher increase in the prices of the lower segment dwellings, not in the highest segment?
Yeah, and this is exactly what I find interesting in this result. It's why, because when the supply of housing doesn't match the demand, so there is not enough supply for those segment of the demand, then this will generate spillover down the distribution, because the abstract workers will take first the housing at the top, and then if there are not any more housing at the top, they will take housing down the distribution, and this gonna lead to an increase in prices also at the bottom. So for those houses which in principle, so in those sub-markets that in principle it's not supposed to be for abstract workers.
So have you checked the new housing construction? Because there is always this complaint that only expensive housing is built, and well, which actually fits well in your story. So there's not enough low segment housing built, and by contrast, there are lots of new housing for rich people. So to speak.
Yeah. So the data, the listing data are. In the listing data, I have a big percentage of new flats. So most of I would say that most of the results are driven by these new flats. Though I want to go back to the ranking. So even if they are all new, there will still be a ranking distribution within each local labor market. So I can consider only new flats, but still they will fit a local distribution of prices. I don't know if this answer.
I have one question. When you say housing of different quality, you meant the price distribution, right?
Yes.
Because I remember I was constructing location and distributional indices within one housing market.
Mm-hmm.
So across the price distribution, but also different locations in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mainly the location that actually did drive these price differences. So I think when you look only at the segments, price segments, you may confound them with good and bad locations within the city. So I'm not sure whether the term housing, like good housing, like bad or good quality housing, really is correct, because it's confounded by the good or bad locations within the city. You know what I mean? Because the price developments across locations within the same city can be very different.
Yes.
So I think you mix the two when you call it like that. You could disentangle that.
I can, so still in the hedonic indices, I'm using postal code fixed effect.
Yeah, but you just control for it. You don't
Yeah.
allow different depreciation rates.
I don't.
Exactly, but that's the thing.
Then, yeah, it's still the ranking is for each area. So in each area, I am ranking from low to high quality without considering the spatial dimension. Yeah.
Exactly, because it may be a good property, or actually a bad property, but in a good location. So bad quality but good location will be equally high as good quality in a bad location.
Okay.
Right? So the term is not right.
Yeah, you think so? Quality is not. Yeah.
Exactly. It's just like high or low price for whatever reason.
Yeah. Then.
But you have location fixed effects. No?
Yeah, I have location fixed effect. Postal code fixed effect. Yeah, this is something.
Yes, but only the effect in the model, but then the interpretation here when you look at the differences.
Yeah, if you mean
Right.
quality as really the material characteristics of the house, these quality.
Okay, you also say quality part of like the quality of location included in the quality.
Yeah, like price really as a synthetic indicator of the quality. And I mentioned at the beginning, I'm taking these based on previous papers. So it should include also both the location and the structure, all the structural quality components.
But then you may just make that very clear in the paper.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk about housing again, but not so much about rents. I'm also more interested in the, so to say, sales market and at a very specific topic there, namely discrimination. So we had discrimination yesterday, so this is also linked to that topic. So we actually try to measure whether there is some discrimination at a very specific point of the transaction process. And I will show you why we're interested in particular at this point, and also a very specific setting. Namely, we are looking at the supply side of the house, the demand. So demand driven affecting the supply side of the housing market, and not the usual way of discrimination where we look at the consumers, so the buyers, but we are actually looking at the sellers and whether there is some discrimination going on. It's a very specific setting, but we also try to convince you why we believe that, or at least one aspect that is also important in the entire discussion about discrimination in the housing market. Okay. On the micro level, there have been several studies when it comes to housing. So a lot of discrimination against buyers or renters, both on the side. For instance, by owners selecting specific renters they prefer or not prefer, those whom they like or not like so much. Also discrimination by real estate agents, by landlords, and also a very prominent one by Airbnb hosts, picking the guests they want. But what we figured out is that there can also be demand-based discrimination affecting sellers. You may think that's weird, but I will show you exactly what we mean by that. And so far, we have not found any evidence so far whether this is actually the case. And we actually try to fill maybe this one specific gap. Also, there was recently a very, not nice for our study, nice news out. Namely, there was a lawsuit settled in the US, in Sausalito, in California, where actually the house of a Black couple was appraised by real estate agents or evaluators, much lower as compared to a white couple. So the setting was like that. The Black couple asked for an appraisal of the house for getting a re-evaluation. That means how much money can they actually take out as mortgage then. And they got a pretty low price. Then they removed all signs of being Black from the house. So they removed all the photos or family photos, whatever, asked white friends to present, to act as if they were the owners of this house, and then ask another real estate appraiser to come to the house and appraise again, and achieved so much higher prices just because they pretended they were white and happy. So this is something that actually then affects this family, because it means they can borrow much less against the value of their property. And they also get a worse credit rating and things like that. So we actually believe that this kind of appraisal bias, if this is affected by some kind of discrimination, can have actually quite important economic consequences. That's why you actually also look at that one. Okay, so and I in wrong direction, right? Yes, so we look at the housing market again. Yes, there's even more discriminational studies that have been done in the past. I don't want to go into detail, but the exact research question we try to answer is there a racial bias against sellers in real estate transactions? This is the question we ask. So what do we do? How do we do that? We run an online randomized experiment in Luxembourg, so that small little country close to Germany. And we try to elicit there the link between willingness to pay, so stated prices of potential buyers, to the origin of the seller. So this is a setting we try to study. And our results, just to summarize this shortly, are that sellers with a sub-Saharan African sounding name receive actually offers that are substantially lower, on average 4%, that would be in euros more than 20,000 euros, lower than other sellers. So this is the main results, but that there's also a lot of heterogeneity in there, and we can actually show that there's particularly one group that's so to say discriminating the most. That would be rather old people, less educated people, and also people that have, given their upbringing and so on, and whatever we know about them, were not a lot in contact with people from sub-Saharan Africa and have not really connections to those countries where there's a large diaspora of those people. Okay, so just to show you a bit what is the setting in Luxembourg and why we also think that our findings here are probably a lower bound for Europe. Yeah, okay, so it's very small first. And the very specific thing about Luxembourg is that almost half of the residents living there are foreign born. So people that have at some point have been immigrants themselves. And in the capital, in Lux City, even 70% are foreigners. So this is really a large share. There are several groups, and they will be important for our experiment. So there are roughly half of the entire country that are of Luxembourgish descent directly. And then there's a large group in Portugal, many French people, some Italians, Belgians, and some Germans. So these would be the largest groups of immigrants. And there is also migration from sub-Saharan African countries. That's actually a rather small group. However, it has the largest growth rates over the last years. So they are also perceived as kind of a new phenomenon in that sense. So the increase in growth is actually 80% over the last years. And we've also checked a lot what was going on in the media, and this kind of new phenomenon, so to say, was discussed quite a lot in this country. So we thought that maybe it's also important from that point of view. Sentiments in general about immigration in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is always stated to be a very open society. And it's actually interesting that when you compare, so here we actually check some questions about feelings or sentiments towards migration, stated in a European Values Survey. And when you then split up Luxembourgish society into foreign-born and native, you can actually see that the native population is very similar to the other countries around. However, the foreign-born people are much more open in Luxembourg, probably for kind of, maybe also because these questions were about people like themselves, right? So in that sense, Luxembourgers themselves are not more or less discriminating or like have bad sentiments in that sense. However, the foreign-born Luxembourgers push actually the overall results towards a direction that makes Luxembourg appear to be super open, simply because there's such a large share. Yes, that's what I just said. Okay, so that's why we actually then check whether, like, who are the groups that are discriminating and what is driving these overall results. Okay, so what we did is we did launch a survey experiment based on like using the platform Lioness. So that's a JavaScript tool that allows you to program an experimental survey that is based on JavaScript, which means that you can just open it on every web browser. So for participating in that survey, you just get a link, and with this personalized link, you just click on it, and then you can enter the experiment, and then you can fill it out once, and then it's blocked forever for you. So this is actually a very nice way how to run experiments today, because people just do that at home then. So that's what we did. And then we recruited adults in Luxembourg as participants. We had 2 recruitment strategies. So the first one was based on a nice opportunity. So in 2019, the EU Silk survey had an extra question. So are you happy that you would be invited for future experiments or surveys? And you would always get some compensation, so not for free. So if you are agreed to signing up, then you would get some compensation. If yes, please state your email address. And quite some people did. And then we recruited from this pool. That's the first. That's also per design tries to be quite representative for the adult population. Unfortunately, these were not enough people. So we also topped it up by recruiting people directly on social media, given that so many people spend so much time on social media. So we run paid advertisements on 3 platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. That means if you log in from an IP address from Luxembourg, then it would pop, and you fulfill the age criteria, then there would be an advertisement would pop up stating you can earn up to 50 euros if you are participating in this survey about housing. We called it a survey about housing. Yes, so we did also that, and that's how we recruited even more participants. We incentivized participation by promising them that they can earn vouchers for a local e-commerce platform. So it's called Let's Shop, and that actually pools very small retailers all across the country. So from your favorite winery, you can then order your cremant directly from them. And then they would actually just get vouchers, and they choose whether they just want for this roughly 10-minute survey, so really short. You can just get something like 10 euros fixed, or you participate in a lottery where you can earn up to 50 euros, and then people just choose what they prefer. Okay, how does the experiment look like? So they all see a sequence of 4 advertisements of apartments to sale in Luxembourg. So these are our 4 houses, H1 to H4, and they mainly differ in the location. So 2 of them they are found in Luxembourg City in a very good residential area and in a Also not bad, but not that expensive residential areas, or around the railway station. One in Esch-sur-Alzette, that's the second largest town, next to the French border, and Esch-sur-Alzette, that's next to the German border, also a small town. They differ a bit in their physical characteristics, but actually the location is the main difference between them. And then they all had a task. They were asked, so that they see the advertisements with these characteristics, and the task was that they should estimate what would be the price when you would sell that property today. And then they just state what they believe was a kind of a market price. They do so for the price today, but also they should estimate what would be the price in 5 years. Okay, so these are the locations we selected, and we also put here different green shades, and the darker green it is, the higher is the share of immigrants. So just to show that the largest ones are in Luxembourg, also in Esch-sur-Alzette there are quite a lot, and also in Esch-sur-Alzette, just to show it's not implausible that different ethnicity than acting as sellers are actually not something surprising for people. Okay, so people have been, when logging in, randomly selected either into a treatment group or in one of two control groups. The treatment groups sees always a name of a private seller that is offering this property for sale. So it's just directly, so who is actually selling that? We try to not have any gender effects. That's why we don't have first names of the seller, but only initials and a surname and a matching email address. And that names should signal the origin of the seller. That was a bit the idea. So we took Schmidt as something very German, Da Silva as probably the most important Portuguese name, Mutombo signaling sub-Saharan names, and Clément as a French name. We also did try with people from these areas where they would recognize the names, and pretty much everyone did. So that was the idea. Unfortunately, Luxembourgish names are as such that they usually have a French first name and a German surname. So you cannot really distinguish between Luxembourgish and German in our experiments. So the two would be the same in that sense. And then we have two control groups. One control group that has no information about any seller. So there's just no seller appearing there. And another control group that is an active control group that sees contact details of a real estate agency. The order of appearance of the advertisements, so everyone sees 4, is completely randomized. Okay, and that's a bit like how advertisements then would look like. So our C1 means that there's just no box of seller information here or contact details. Then C2 would see this real estate agency. And then in the treatment group, they would also see then the name and the email address and also telephone number, but we just that out not, I mean, they were all not existent when we did the experiment, but if you now want to call this number, we thought maybe you should not, just to be sure. Okay, sorry. Okay. And yeah, that's a bit like what people then were doing. So they were just evaluating the values of these properties. Okay, so overall, what we then did is between February and May 2022, we had this study running and collected roughly 700 full observations that corresponds to more than like almost 2,800 single evaluation because everyone had to evaluate several houses. These are super, that these characteristics don't tell you a lot. The only thing is in terms of what they wanted to show is that in terms of age, we tried to get a bit older people, so people that were already active on the housing market, so that they have a bit of feeling. We tried to do so by setting age restrictions on social media, and we were successful, fortunately. Also, we hope to have half men and women, which was also successful. We had a bit too many people with good education that also fits the Luxembourgish society. but not too bad in terms of Luxembourgish share. It was perfect because just as in reality, we had roughly half of them are native Luxembourgers and half of them were immigrants. So in that sense, it matches a bit the population there. And also we tested whether there was any balance in covariates between our treatment group and control group, and that was not the case, fortunately. So the randomization was successful in that sense. So first, a plausibility check when we just merged the valuations by location, which was the main differential between these advertisements. People are not bad, actually. They all got it, that good locations should have better, higher prices and so on. And in relative terms, they actually matched quite well of what either expert said. By expert, we interviewed real estate agents. How much do you think are these property worth? But then also looked at the average prices per square meter according to a national register. And then when you just look at the relative differences, people say something quite okay. So people are also not too bad in evaluating houses. So we think we can trust that people did not just say anything, but they were really thinking about it when they were evaluating these properties. And this is maybe our main regression we then estimated. So the first thing, the first column, in general, we regressed current market sales prices in log on these kinds of different experimental variables, in the sense in which treatment or control group were you, and then if you were in the treatment group, which advertisements, which seller names did you actually see for each property? So we can estimate these effects. Overall, we find that as compared to the control groups, if there is a private owner or seller, then people think that the property is worth a bit less, which maybe makes sense. If you sell by yourself, that may signal something. So that's something we find in general. But then the question is that equally the case for all types of sellers, depending on the name of the seller, or are some names receiving lower price evaluation as compared to others? And that's what we then actually do from in column 2 to 6. We split it up by name. And what we find is that this entire effect is almost only driven by the Mutombo name. So this person that signals origin from Africa is getting the worst and the lowest appraisal from all the people, no matter how we do the specification of our regression exactly. And that is actually then what we try to argue, that this is actually really some discrimination that is going on in appraisals at the very beginning already. Okay, then you can argue that this is only the mean what you do in this regression, and that's not that important when it comes to housing markets, because there's a bidding going on. So usually only the highest bids are really important, right? So the idea is, if on average appraisals are lower, it's not so important. What is important is whether at the very top end of the bids, there is a bias, right? And that's why we also estimate some quantile regressions for different parts of the distribution, and actually find that, yes, also the very top, there is this bias. And actually the bias, or the penalty as we call it here, is present and also similar in size across the entire price distribution. We also formally test that, whether the entire price distribution shifted downwards, and that's significant. We also do that, we also show that with the CDFs, actually, in showing that the upper tail is just much shorter when you are a Mutombo seller as compared to the other sellers. So in that sense, it would also have consequences when you really were then selling your house. Also, it's not just today. We also ask them, how much do you think will this house or this flat be, how much can you achieve in prices in 5 years? So what is the future expected price, they state. And the thing is that also for the future prices, the penalty is still there. And it's actually even larger when we measure it in, when we quantify it. So it's not just today's prices are affected, but also future prices are affected. Right. Then we do a lot of robustness checks, just to be sure that what we have in mind, what we wanted to measure, is really robust. And yeah, a lot of technical ones and things like that, and also falsification tests. And yeah, so everything is actually supporting that the one Mutombo benefit we find is really there. But what I think is more interesting is the heterogeneity analysis. That's why I will talk a bit more about that, because we try to find out who is actually deriving these results, who of the participants, which part of the society in Luxembourg, so to say, is actually maybe behaving in these discriminatory actions. From the very first results from the survey, one could already think that it could be more the native people rather than immigrants. That could be a bit, given their statements there, it could be an indication. So we tried to measure several angles of heterogeneity here. First, between men and women, there's no difference. They're both equally, like, strongly or weakly discriminating in that sense. That's also in line with previous literature. There was never found a gender effect when it comes to that. But what has always been found is that there is an age effect. So it's usually the older people that are more discriminatory and younger people being more open. I'm sorry for everyone above 40 here. We just split the sample by 40 because that was our median age we observed. So in that sense, we call those people now here old, sorry. Young. And the results were like really largely driven by the old people here. And the young were actually quite, I mean, looks positive for the future, maybe. Then what we also checked was education, something that has been found by the literature a lot. Okay, I will speed up. And it's driven by people with low education, and high and low. It was actually so high was postgraduate education, high school graduation education. They are not discriminated. However, those with low education are discriminating a lot. Also, we measured from their personal histories and their own, so where the participants actually come from and their parents where they come from. And it was driven by those people who had no previous strong relationship with communities where more people from sub-Saharan Africa are actually residing. This is also in line with previous findings. And also there was a question whether people like diversity or not. And it's a bit that people that prefer low diversity places are discriminating more than people who think that diversity is something good. Okay. It could be a penalty or it could be favoritism for your own group. We can rule that out. It's really a penalty for the others, not just that I like my own group. We also do heterogeneity results. We try to disentangle taste-based discrimination, because you may just dislike some people for whatever reason, or statistical discrimination, meaning that you had some previous knowledge or information that kind of gives you a reason why you believe that some houses are worth less or not. I was not going to details, but we can actually show that this is everything we find is in line with statistical discrimination of what we are finding. Right. Also, we also show that economically quite significant, given that we find that the entire distribution of prices is shifted downwards, is also means that very likely that the final sales prices will be lower. That is really bad in that sense. So there's a negative penalty for them. But on the other hand, it also creates windfall wins for the buyer that is then really making this transaction with the seller that is this. So it's losing money because of lower appraisals, and the buyer is actually gaining because he buys at cheaper prices, but also saves a lot of money in administrative fees, given that they are all as percentages of the sales price at the end. So actually there's a lot of windfall wins for the potential buyer, and that is quite a lot. And we do some envelope calculations of what that actually means and how big in size that actually is. Just to show that also economically, the shifts, discrimination in the structure of the entire costs that accrue to different people and different parties is actually creating a lot of, economists would just say, inefficiencies, and also interesting shifts, and we just try to highlight them and what it really is. And yes, so I think given the time's over, I don't say anything about conclusions, but this is anyhow just what I summarized what I just said before. Good, so thanks and looking forward. Yes.
Really, really interesting. I have two thoughts. The graph that you showed earlier, you mentioned two parameters, the education and familiarity.
Education and?
How, if people are linked to Africa.
Yeah.
And that works perfectly with vast literature that I guess you know, but I think it can really add depth to your research. The first is literature that links higher levels of education with political perspectives, like the less educated you are, the more nationalist you are, and vice versa.
Yeah.
And that just matches perfectly. And the other is the literature that deals with segregation. And the more you're familiar with minority groups, the less prejudiced you are, which makes sense. So it works perfectly. And that's like, probably if we're talking about trends in research, so I think in the last 2 decades, that's probably the most researched field in social science. So that just really fits in and it really adds depth, and it's great, I think, to just link it. So that's just one comment. And another question that I have, that was a comment, it wasn't a really question. I was thinking while you were talking, I don't know Luxembourg at all. So it was very easy to just, see it from an overview. How do you duplicate it to other countries and societies? Because from what, I guess you had your reasons, because you're very familiar with the political or the social structure there. How do you do it in countries? Because there, I guess there is a prejudice against people that are originated from Africa, but in each country, in each society, in each period, in each region, you probably have different groups that you'd like to look at. So you need people that are implanted in the particular place that can tell you this family name just reflects that. And so it's quite complicated.
It's complicated. And I mean, we have probably 5 pages on the Luxembourg context.
Yeah.
Also why we actually looked at these 4 population groups, why this makes sense for Luxembourg. Portuguese is just one of the largest old immigration group, so to say.
So it's different generations of immigrants, which is interesting on itself.
Right, but they are a large group, right? So it makes sense for Luxembourg to look at the Portuguese community. Was it, for instance, Austria or Germany? That group may actually be a Turkish population or so, right? Because here the context is just in that sense. The so-called guest workers that came to Luxembourg were from Portugal for a long period of time. So that's why this group is very important. It's French and German because these are the big neighbors. And it's always a bit like, what do the French say? What do the Germans say? And then Luxembourg, we are in the middle. That's a bit the paradigm of this country. And you have still a lot of people coming from these 2 countries, right? And also language-wise, these 2 are the most influential ones in that sense. This is really trimmed to the concept of Luxembourg. In that sense, the African community potential also due to the influence via Portugal and France is just a really big one and rising one in Luxembourg that may not be the case in others. but then it may be another distant new group, whatever that is, right? But the context would always determine which group you're looking at.
So just a suggestion, and then I'll finish with that. Maybe it's worth thinking about building a model, because your basic findings, which I think are really important, I guess you can identify criteria like in future research to have a look at first, second, third generation of immigration.
Yes.
And minority groups like national minorities, or like to really try to build a model that's universal, because I would assume that at least in most societies in Europe, you'd see similar patterns.
Similar,
Makes sense.
different mix of nationalities, but it's
Just think of the criteria, like broad criteria, and see how it works
Yeah.
in different countries, and that could really, I think, add some depth to an already very impressive research.
It's actually fun. Yeah,
It is.
not the results, sorry, but the data.
Results are depressing, yeah, everywhere.
I was wondering if you can actually rationalize this discrimination economically. So if I assume, and I guess that people didn't see like a lot of pictures or any pictures of the apartment, that the kitchen, for example, is differently structured from a family that has a sub-Saharan background compared to a family with a French background. So I anticipate that I will have to invest more if I buy an apartment from.
Exactly. And we got this comment a lot. Some people are saying, actually, like the Indians, whenever you buy from an Indian, you should expect that your kitchen is smelly. That was a bit the comment we got. And maybe some people think so similarly, just in a way, like with different groups. And this is exactly statistical discrimination. That you have some information gathered during your life that gives you, for like justified or not justified reasons, you have the feeling that this must be worthless. Wherever that comes from, not rational or whatever, but you just have this information that would also include exactly that. And that everything we do here, it may not be that you hate those people or so, no, it may actually be exactly that. Or at least that the entire experiment seems to be in line with this theory of where discrimination may come from. But again, we believe that the outcomes are important, right? That's why we believe that the effect sizes are actually important, and that these groups that are affected from a common cliche, in that sense, that may be true or not, for an individual, they all are affected or actually penalized by that. And so that's why we think that only the outcome is really important. The why, we can say it's more in line with that or that, is maybe, or that would be our argument, is actually maybe not more or less important.
It's not the motivation.
Exactly, and also here it's not about an individual interaction you had when you went to the apartment and had a look, and then you just had a feeling, you know, it's smelly. That's not the case here. Here you don't have any information on that. It's just that everything that is starting to work in your brain when you see this name, whatever that is, leads to the outcome that you think it's worthless.
Yeah, but if I may add to this, because I had similar impression that I don't know whether you can call it discrimination, because that's exactly the problem that you mentioned, that you don't have the information. So it's probably just signal extraction. You're missing a big part of the information, and I guess the average Mutombo has lower income, less education, and so on. So, I mean, you're just inferring all the missing parts that you have in the advertisement.
That may be, exactly.
And then I would call it discrimination, just
Yeah.
signal extraction, maybe.
Definition of statistical discrimination.
That's the definition of statistical discrimination. We also call it mainly penalty, appraisal penalty, actually in the paper, because that is what is happening here. They get in appraisals a penalty because of their name. That's what we measure. We link it then to statistical discrimination. There this term is used because that's just what statistical discrimination is. Right? So whatever else is then happening, we don't know, right? But it's just like just showing that there could be a very first feeling of what is the price of this house. that may actually then, if that is shared by many potential buyers, and that is what our experiment actually showed, the entire distribution of potential buyers, and lots of people did do these appraisals, they all assess these properties with a lower price. If you think that these could all be potential buyers, then the seller will just also the highest bid will be lower as compared to others. Right? So in that sense, we would also say it has some economic meaning, because if a large crowd of people potentially want to buy a house, think it's worth less, then from the very beginning, you have worse chances on this market.
Wouldn't you need to control for all these other factors to say that it's really?
No, exactly. I mean, we do do a lot of controls, but our experiment is set up that everything is randomized. Right?
I mean, for part of the seller, you need to control for everything. So that's really there are two exactly same apartments, and then one is sold by Mutombo, and that's.
Yeah, but that's what we do in the experiment. So some people see this apartment, like apartment H1 with seller N1, some H N2, and so on. This randomization strategy is exactly doing that. That's also why we think an experiment was necessary, because you can never observe it on a market like that. Because it's never the case that like the one apartment is sold by 5 different sellers. That's hardly ever happens, right? So you usually cannot observe that, but in an experimental setting, you can. That's why we think that it was important to have on here. Otherwise, I don't know how to really tackle this research question if you're not doing it in an experimental setting.
Yeah. Okay. In the end, like, I understand that the effect is important and not that the cause of this discrimination. It could be based on racism or on other things. But usually people would see the house and would have those information. So maybe the effect would not exist in the end if they saw the house.
We also say that it may be corrected or may not be. But if it's at the very beginning already different expectations set by offers you receive, or people that actually read your advertisements or so on, we just believe that there's already something going on. Yeah. Whatever the outcome then is after the entire negotiation process or whatever, that's a different story, but it's just the very first setting of ideas a bit.
I'm Kenton. I'm gonna introduce you to the paper with a little how we came to this project. It's a collaborative paper. I'll give you the title in a second. I'm primarily an ethnographer, and this is a big data paper, so it's a little bit of a collaboration. First time presenting it. We just finished this a few days ago and submitted it. So my work typically looks at tenant movements, and I'm interested in how different tenant movements, landlord, different political actors influence the reproduction of policies, the reproduction of government, right? So these are a couple of recent articles. I'm on the job market, right? So you have to share these things. So when we think of housing policy, we typically think of policymakers, we think of planners writing them, implementing them. And this broader work that I'm interested in is looking at different political groups and the kind of network of relations, of institutional relations, power dynamics, and how that's reproduced. So for the paper today, so first of all, this kind of work is getting a lot more attention, tenant activism. Obviously in this city, there'll be a couple little photos in this city just to add some flavor because I work on Berlin. But the New York Times has recently reported on the Kansas City Tenants Union. A rent revolution is coming. Tara Ragavir is one of the most influential tenant activists in the country. They just put 3 people in the city council in Kansas City this week, actually. But what I want to do in this paper today is take a step back and ask what ideas dominate the housing political field across the US. Okay, so I'm usually looking at the micro level, and I've kind of tried to collaborate with some folks, try something a bit different. So what ideas dominate? And I don't know where I point to. Too far. There we go. So some contenders, I'm just going to give stuff that's in the media. This is a giant rent control fight that was in the capital of Sacramento. So fights over regulating rents. This is a homes guarantee plan to reintroduce public housing, to protect renters, to try to even decommodify housing, they say, with community land trusts and co-ops connected to a Green New Deal. This was actually the platform taken up by Bernie Sanders. This is a mass protest, one of my little Berlin vignettes, a mass protest, 20,000 people, one subway stop from where we were yesterday, the day that the Supreme Court struck down the 5-year rent freeze in Berlin. So people coming into the streets, people aware of these issues. In Los Angeles, this is last summer, City Council voted to eminent domain, also a building that had been on rent strike. They didn't distribute the funds, they didn't repurchase the building, but this is a kind of claim as well around re-socializing housing. You see op-eds as a way to discuss ideas. So this is one of the most influential, Scott Wiener, California politicians promoting pro-supply policies, deregulating single-family zoning across California with a New York Times op-ed, also homeless shelter, subsidizing folks challenging the discourse on Twitter. This is a female politician, this is a female scholar, of the kind of pro-supply debates, that they are overly problematic or simplistic. But again, these are kind of debates in the whole field, calling them YIMBY bros, housing bros. So the kind of initial title for this was, is there more discourse around pro-supply policy across the country, housing bros, so to speak, this pejorative term, or on the rent woes of tenants? So the paper that we just submitted that I'm going to present today is about mapping housing discourse in times of crisis and the growing debate over rental housing policy in the United States. And so I've written this with Andre Comandon, who's a postdoc, or I think a guest researcher now at the University of Southern California, and Andrew Messamore, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Texas. And then these are the institutions I've been with in Berlin and Los Angeles. So we're going to focus not on the whole field of housing policy. So I'm going to basically exclude home ownership. I'm looking at rental housing policy debate in the US because the rental housing sector has grown in attention, primarily post the global financial crisis. I mean, home ownership peaked in 2006 at 69%. It dropped over the next few years to its lowest rate in a while, to 63%, despite the US adding 25 million new households during this period. And it has recovered a little bit back to 66%. So you see the two major crises over the last 15 years, the global financial crisis, obviously subprime lending implicated therein, and the reemergence of skirmishes over evictions, right? Folks battling the police over homes. So this is just kind of different dynamics going on. COVID also, you saw cries to cancel rent online. You saw people, told to shelter in place. So home kind of playing an important role. And so within this spectrum, I think we're particularly keen on being aware throughout the discourse, throughout what ideas are being discussed of inequality and how inequality is playing out in the increased attraction or discourse around rental housing in the United States, which of course the US is sort of the paradigmatic, in many ways, homeownership society. That's part of the American dream. And simultaneously, how this is relating to polarization between landlords and tenant groups and others. And so, I mean, this is talk about polarization. Landlord Association in Los Angeles promoting gun violence prevention in case you have an active shooter that might be in your workplace, right? So this is the kind of training they're offering to landlords in LA. So again, I'm interested in trying to understand within this context different political dynamics. And so the main question motivating this talk is how can we interpret the growth and the changing structure of rental housing policy debate? And so what we've chosen is to look at Twitter discourse and call this mass political discourse. And why social media? Because 95 million Twitter users are in the United States, 23% of the population, half the country supposedly get their news through social media. This is the Pew Research Center coming up with this data. we think it's the largest arena of debate over housing policy by including ordinary people, activists, journalists, planners, academics, political leaders, right? And so although there's growing attention that we see between op-eds in the streets, new legislation against the police when you're getting evicted. What we don't understand is the speech or the kind of political ideas that are getting put out there, measuring it, analyzing it, and interpreting it. So a lot of the work that we've seen in the last 15 years, I guess, refocusing on housing, I would say, looks at housing markets or conditions. There's less work, and I would kind of put my work previously in this on the political dynamics. And there's a new subfield in political science in the last couple of years. Folks from some of the leading universities in the country kind of have advocated to relook at how governance of markets operates, and that so much of our attention as political scientists is focused on the last mile of politics or the implementation of policy. And they're saying, well, what ideas exist before that last mile, before it's already being debated in the Senate? And also to take a step back and not just look at a single institution, but the relationship between institutions. So they're advocating to think about power, think about polarization, and they have kind of three different prescriptions to look at how institutions are formed, to look at agenda setting, and to look at venue shifting. I think institutional formation is clear, agenda setting I'll get to, and by agenda shifting, they mean really how battles move, like Dennis spoke about in the courts, from the legislation being passed to it being sued, going to a court, from one scale to another scale, right? So we're gonna focus on agenda setting, and this is typically thought of as elites, policymakers, et cetera, as a way to kind of inform, coordinate, prime voters, set party agendas, et cetera. And I'm gonna get into a set of elite agendas and non-elite agendas. And I would say mass political discourse, it's not a non-elite agenda, but it's a kind of interaction between elites, non-elites, and other publics. And then what we're trying to do here is create the discursive field of rental housing policy, which is the public battlefields where collective actors compete and give meaning to an issue. So, elites are those who have vastly disproportionate control over access to a resource. Non-elites, this is a nice quote I like from Max Weber, from Politics as a Vocation. One may engage in politics and hence seek to influence the distribution of power within and beyond political structures as an occasional politician. So by looking at political speech online, in how we're going to do it, we're capturing kind of both sets of groups, right? So one kind of foil that I'm gonna hold up is the Menino Survey of Mayors from Boston University. It's actually by the Initiative on Cities, where I'm joining as a postdoc in a couple months, and they survey mayors and they asked what's kind of the major problem in your city. And 81% say among the top two issues that the cost of housing is a major issue. And the solutions in an open-ended format, the top two solutions that they identify are to increase supply or to increase subsidies, right? So we're already beginning to get a map, right? So we've gone from all this noise at the beginning. I'm trying to set up how I'm going to build the field. And I'm going to use this as a kind of elite agenda setting foil. Like, this is how mayors think about what are policy solutions to housing unaffordability, right? Rental housing. So what we've done in constructing the discursive field is we've identified policy areas, 6 key policy areas. I'm going to define them on the next slide. Within those policy areas, 41 keywords that we think capture most of the discourse. The cutoff was a keyword needed to receive 5,000 impressions on Twitter. So this script was written through Python using Twarp2, which is connected to Twitter's former service. The access was actually open and free to download until Elon Musk took it over. There's 70 different variables in a tweet that you get when you download. We focus on 7 We actually manually geotagged because, and about 29% of the tweets mention a location in the tweet. And so we actually don't use the geocode if an individual claims where they say they are, but we're interested in the connection between the policy term and the city in the tweet, basically. And this is not telling you where people are tweeting from, it's telling you, we think, where people are tweeting about. So we have these 7 different, components: text, date, type, user ID, etc. And we have a corpus of 13.5 million tweets. And again, this is not a survey. It's not like, we're not meant to interpret this as a survey, and we haven't yet done a sentiment or network analysis within this, right? Which I think is exciting directions that this can go. So the way we define the 6 main policy areas is looking at the private rental market, that's privately owned, the subsidized rental market, also privately owned, the state-owned or public housing, right? State-owned, pro-supply positions, and these are kind of mixed in terms of ownership status, pro-supply positions, anti-development or NIMBY positions, and fair housing or anti-discrimination positions. Now, the keywords and the policy buckets are completely US housing policy design. They have different sets of problems, how they see them. They have different visions of solutions to those problems. And then we have specific policies. These have some overlap with the keywords that we use. This is just a photo in Friedrichshain after a battle over a eviction. But I just mention it because it's a nice photo, and gentrification, you see these kinds of keywords come up in the street. So we exclude gentrification because it's 4.2 million tweets and too vague to fit into one of these specific categories. We exclude affordable housing, which has a legal specific term meaning in the US, but also we think it's too vague. So we've constructed these 41 keywords. These are not, I should say, with a number of the different tables that will come up. There's 15 million tweets. Some of those tweets mention different words in different buckets, right? So none of these totals are cumulative. And then we compare these to 3 different studies that are recent, that are also looking at sets of policies. Yona Freemark's recent work looking at upzoning and downzoning across the US. We checked against his keywords for that comprehensive literature review. Karen Chappell and colleagues are looking at a range of anti-discrimination, anti-displacement policy, and Megan Hatch is actually looking at different kinds of housing policy across the whole US. So we compare kind of our keywords with those different recent contributions. And then I'm going to start giving you figures in a second. But what we've done, and this is kind of like, I was going to pretend I was inspired by Constantine. It's a little different, but I was excited to see that. What we've done is created this heuristic, which I call the stamp table, because it is this kind of, how much are these different policies relating to state control versus market mechanisms versus production of new units versus protection, right? And then we have the 4 quadrants accordingly labeled. And so this is where we put the different areas: pro-supply, subsidized rental, privately owned, but getting some state subsidy, anti-development, NIMBY issues, primarily market-oriented, very protectionist, not productive. We have private rental, very protectionist, slightly market, but a state intervention. So let's not put that on the market side. We have fair housing regulation, and we have state-owned. So in the US, state-owned public housing, it's a little bit strange, but it's on the productionist line because there's a law prohibiting development of new public housing called the Fair Cop Amendment. But it could obviously be productionist, right? So it's somewhere in the middle. So we set up the heuristic this way to interpret the findings, right? And what we find in this time period between 2015 and 2023 is that private rental discourse massively is like outperforms the others. Outperforms, it's much more prominent. You see fair housing fairly dominant, anti-discrimination discourse, and then followed by public housing. You see over time, don't know why. But you see basically the onset of COVID right here, an explosion of the discourse increasing, especially over private rental. Also later, even since COVID subsides. So we basically divide the data into pre-COVID. We start at 2015 because that's when Twitter hit 300 million users in the United States. And it's basically plateaued since then. At 2020, you see a kind of massive shift in growth. But after it subsided, you don't see it, or after peak COVID, we say, you don't see a major drop off of the tweets. I'm not going to get into this so much, but what I just showed you is the all tweets. That includes retweets and other derivative tweets if someone's commenting. And the original tweets have similar but slightly different. So this is the original source of who it's tweeting. Okay, so now we're going to look in the time periods a little bit. So before COVID, you see public housing actually as the largest bucket and subsidized quite a bit larger than it is later, right? You then, when COVID comes in, private rental market regulations massively overtake and then still remain at the top after COVID. And you see anti-discrimination growing significantly after COVID, right? So there are these interesting, dynamics between them. I mean, so these are percentages comparing, of course, them against each other. And I think there's insight there in understanding the whole discursive field, which I think is the primary motivation of the paper. But on the other hand, it's limited because, of course, this is not the right slide to look at this, but anti-development discourse is growing significantly. Most of the policy areas are growing significantly after COVID, right? And so us comparing the broader discursive field doesn't mean that these conversations aren't also happening in silos, which they are. So you see here during COVID, there's a massive explosion compared to a lot longer time period beforehand. And then finally, New York is massively outperformed. I mean, there's way more discourse in New York, and it's sort of, that's, I think, a key thing to point out there. In terms of then we divide out per the different policy areas, what's dominating. You see like Los Angeles like the private rental regulation discourse, and there's been a lot of rent control policy discourse there, so that's not surprising, but it's very high. Also Boston as well, and like a capital city of New York already, right? So you see the large cities with rent control and the capital cities. In terms of subsidized rental, also Atlanta is a capital city, so that's not surprising. And then you see this interesting dynamic in terms of pro-supply and anti-development, YIMBY issues and NIMBY issues, often paralleling each other, being high together. When it's high pro-development issues in one city, it's going to be high anti-development in another. And then in terms of the most common hashtags within each of the policy areas, among the top 6, 3 are COVID related. I mean, rent relief is by far the largest as well. So again, returning to the kind of how do we interpret this? I mean, in terms of, right, there's all sorts of differences occurring pre-COVID, shifting toward more private rental regulation and anti-discrimination. But in general, this is what I kept trying to fix. It's right ugly. But what you have is actually the 3 largest policy areas around rental housing discourse in the US in this whole time period are in the state protectionist, the strong state intervention and tenant protectionist bucket. The next 2, which are the 2 that overlap the most with politician agenda setting from the Menino survey, are in the market production area. So the kind of big finding of the takeaway findings, like we mentioned, what elites say is pro-supply subsidized housing are solutions. What we see in the discursive field between the whole time period is this strong state tenant protectionist policy approach, I guess, or not policy approach, but policy discourse and debate. Pre-COVID, state-owned dominates and subsidized and fair housing, and then during peak, private rental explodes, and then afterwards, private rental and fair housing continue to dominate the discussion. So, thank you.
I just ask you, what do you mean, or what the meaning of anti-development and the fair housing?
The difference.
Yeah, what does it mean?
So
What's
anti-development. So anti-development, we can go to the keywords, we can.
Yeah, but maybe in that graph, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Or-
So basically, this is trying to stop development in a certain neighborhood of new units, of whether they're subsidized units, they're homeless shelters, or it's just private, it's just market rate housing. So there's a huge relationship in US housing policy discourse between NIMBYs wanting to continue single family zoning and exclusionary zoning, and people trying to abolish single family zoning, abolishing minimum height restrictions, promoting new urbanism, more walkable neighborhoods. And these are kind of constantly in political discourse with each other. That's why, I mean, we've tried to create these as the most general framings, like state-owned as opposed to public housing, because I actually think it's more clear for publics that don't.
And fair housing,
And so fair housing basically regulates discrimination based on race, gender, other forms of identity in zoning and in housing programs.
Thank
It's
you.
a Fair Housing Act.
Yeah, the Fair Housing Act, and it's been reformed a number of times. I mean, even now vouchers like for Section 8, there's not actually there's not national provisions protecting based on race discrimination, or it would be actually race discrimination. You can discriminate on not taking a voucher or taking a voucher.
Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. I have kind of two questions. The first one, I mean, we already see here that these topics are sometimes mutually exclusive, but it would be interesting to see it in the data. So, for example, to see how how correlated the occurrences of the corresponding keywords in the tweets are. And also, it's interesting. I mean, we can see in this cross diagram already that the discourse of elite is different from that of the other participants of the discussion. But then it would be interesting to see to show it somehow, for example, by frequency of the corresponding topics occurring in the discourse. So to say, I don't know, for example, the elite questions occupy, I don't know, 20% of the whole discussion of other people, or in other words, put it differently, so the elites ignore 80% of what is discussed by general public. And then I said two questions, but then well, it's not a question, it's a compliment. Or suggestion. It would be interesting also to see because you have a kind of policy cycle. So you have sometimes the people that are not satisfied, they somehow show it in the streets, in the media, then the policy gets aware of it and then starts or doesn't start to reform the policy. And then these reforms in turn, they cause further discussions. So whether it would be possible to visualize this whole cycle.
Yeah, I mean, it's very descriptive of, we have all of these policies, we're kind of trying to make the first hack at it. We do the geographical look, we look at sources of tweets being original or retweets, and then the relationship between them pre, during, and post peak COVID. And I think we'd like to do more, network analysis of who's doing the tweets and the interactions. So thanks for the encouragement.
So just one question. Is there some way to say something about who are these people that are active on Twitter? in the sense that you know their social demographics in some way, and I mean, they're not the general population.
I mean, it's 23% of the, I mean, no, I mean, who's tweeting about housing versus the 23% of the US on Twitter?
It's a strong selection based to people that are interested in politics, probably, right?
Yeah.
But then, so yeah, discourse, yeah, but I mean, that's probably not a majority, I assume. But can you say something about that? Like,
So Twitter, there's not specific details. We can get into if they associate with an organization. And when we dig deeper into the sources being organizations, we did pull out tweets of like the New York Times. They'll have a button below an article that says retweets, and then it will be a standard tweet that you can just push tweet. We removed those. So someone had to manually retweet in their own feed to it to be in the overall tweets. But yeah, I mean, I think one of my co-authors is quite stern about us not, making kind of survey-like claims about the data in terms of representativeness or so. I mean, at this point, it's just, this is, as far as we can tell, the biggest discourse around housing in the US. And we're just like, everyone is quite shocked that the pro-supply conversation is the lowest, because that's occupying a lot of media attention in terms of op-eds, cover stories, and other lead kind of sources. So
you just look at a different segment of the discourse in that sense. Because you say like, when you said others are taken up more by the media, and maybe this discourse.
Yeah, I mean, we're not, yeah.
What discussed there, also maybe reaching a different audience in that sense than Twitter.
Yeah, I mean.
Right, so the question is, like, when you think about it, like, at the end, in a democracy, it's about electing, so what is the majority, right?
Yeah, I have.
But can you say anything about that, I see?
So there isn't a survey, and I'm actually not giving you the media as a generalized scrape of the media, which we could do. I mean, that's a lot of, like, my colleagues at the VZB look at protest event counts and other kind of big newspaper database. But newspapers have, I mean, people are arguing between newspapers' representativeness, they're more standard, versus Twitter is like raw from people. But I think, even when I say, oh, the elites are talking about this, I mean, that's like, or our friend in New York yesterday was like, everybody's talking about rent control. And I was like, well, the surveys are, the mayors are saying this. So I'm giving you my own bias that, I feel like, but as a housing scholar in the US, talking to other housing people, looking at online, I mean, that's what we thought, but. The US is going in socialist directions.
If there are no further questions, then I suggest to stop here and to thank. We have lunch, 2:00, and then after lunch, hopefully we'll have a vivid discussion on housing market issues.
1 o'clock, no?